It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Uzi Young. For over 10 months, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has captured global headlines. Since the conflict began on February 24th, many of the same questions have been asked over and over, from why the war began and Vladimir Putin's calculations, to how long the war will last and how the world will change afterwards. Those questions remain unanswered to this day, and for some more insight, we turn to US historian Ronald G. Suny, Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. Very warm welcome to you, Professor. It's always an honor to have you on our show. Thank you for joining us.
And I so enjoy being with you.
Thank you so much. And well, over the past 10 months, really, we've heard many assumptions about Vladimir Putin and his narrative. And while some believe he's bent on removing Ukraine from the map, and well, what do you think is his view of Russia and Ukraine's history, and how do you think that really motivates his actions?
I think it's very important to try to separate what might be his realistic geopolitical interests and the kind of propaganda and strange histories that he weaves and makes public in order to convince people of what he's doing in Ukraine. So from a geopolitical or realpolitik point of view, his actions make some sense, though it's hard to justify the actual invasion and the cruel war atrocities and so forth that have occurred since February of this year. Of course, to begin with, Putin, and I think he exaggerated this, thought that the West was presenting a real danger to Russia by inviting Ukraine into NATO, by training Ukrainian soldiers, and turning Ukraine, which he sees as a kind of brother nation, into a base or a kind of ally of the West. So that would be his geopolitical reasons. And from that, he then decided that he needed to do something. Indeed, lately he's been saying in his news conferences and his speeches, we had no other choice. And all of that sort of realpolitik has been dressed up in a kind of pseudo-historical understanding of Russia always being the enemy of the West, and Russia, in fact, being a victim, and the West bent on, in fact, destroying or dismembering Russia, just as the Soviet Union was eventually dismembered. So there's a grand narrative, which I think is more the public face, and they're the real concerns, geopolitical, which he exaggerates. There was no real danger from Ukraine. There was no provocation and no real reason for the invasion.
And Professor, well, Ukraine on Monday called on the United Nations to unseat Russia from the Security Council, saying that Russia illegally occupies the seat of the USSR in the UN Security Council. I mean, what are your thoughts on this statement?
That's another grand gesture of some kind. It never can happen. The United Nations was founded on an agreement among the great powers of who would be on the Security Council and who would have effectively a veto over major decisions. And that was the only way to get the Soviet Union and Britain and United States, France, China, onto the agreement that let the UN function for this long period of time, whereas its predecessor, the League of Nations, fell apart precisely because great powers like the United States did not want to participate. So that's a non-starter. It's a gesture. It's a propaganda, you can say gesture, but it has no real meaning.
I see. And well, apparently Moscow is buying rockets and artillery shells from North Korea. Do you think this move is unprecedented? I mean, what does this deal really say about the current state of Russia's military supplies?
Both Koreas, South and North, have been approached by sides in this war to send weapons of some kind or another, maybe artillery shells of some kind from South Korea, rockets from North Korea, to aid one or the other side. And there are reports and rumors. It's very hard sometimes to figure out if these are in fact true or not by both sides that such moves have actually been made. I wouldn't be surprised if, in fact, North Korea seeing itself as a kind of ally with Russia, did in fact supply some things to the Russian forces fighting in Ukraine. North Korea, in its public statements, has said it's proud of the way Russia has stood up to what it considers, as Russia does, the global hegemon, the dominant world power across the globe, that is the United States. So in a funny way, countries all across the world, India's one, China, obviously, North Korea, many African nations, Indonesia made some gestures in this direction, have in fact worried about the dominance of the United States, now more powerful than ever in some ways because of the unity it's managed to create among its NATO allies. So we got the world sort of divided between those who are willing to go along with this American dominance and those who are more hesitant, which, by the way, even includes some American allies like Israel, who are not, in fact, voting enthusiastically for the war in Ukraine, or some of the Gulf states, which are so dependent on the United States.
Professor Suny, well, it's clear that President Putin wasn't expecting the war to stretch on for this long. And have the goals of Russia changed as Ukraine has continued to fight back for months longer than they may have expected?
Oh, absolutely, they've changed. I mean, this is a different war than the one that Putin thought he was going into in February. And most analysts agree with this. There was a long piece in the New York Times which went through all of this. It turns out we basically agree that Putin originally thought it would be easy to invade Ukraine, decapitate the state, either kill or capture or force into exile President Zelensky, send paratroopers near Kiev to an air force, take the capital, and maybe install a puppet government. None of that happened. It turned out the initial invasion was bungled, it failed, and the Ukrainians proved to be far better fighters than anyone thought. Even the United States was doubtful that the Ukrainians could stand up this long. And look what they've done. They've turned this whole thing around. This has become a war backed enthusiastically by much of Europe and by the United States against Russia. So the initial thrust of Putin's policies had to change. Then there was a time when the original invasion and what I would call a kind of episode of terror war in which atrocities were committed in places like Bucha. That's a name that's going to go down along with places like Guernica in the Spanish Civil War, or My Lai in the American war in Vietnam. Places like Bucha became killing fields for Russian soldiers to try to create a road into Ukraine and to bludgeon the Ukrainians into submission. None of that worked. At the moment, it seems, and it's hard to predict because things are changing, that Russia is now more or less ready to try to defend the areas it has captured. That is the Donbass, large parts of the Donbass, and the kind of crescent of land from largely outside Kharkiv to Kherson, a land bridge that would connect Russia proper to Crimea. And that was some of the things that were mentioned recently when Putin and his Minister of Defense spoke to the military leaders in Moscow.
Well, nobody is happy about this war, and definitely not China, which has been a growing ally of Russia. And Russian President Vladimir Putin, he's expected to meet President Xi Jinping of China before the end of the year. And how important do you think is the Moscow-Beijing relationship becoming? And do you think President Xi is going to pressure the Russian leader to end the war?
I would call the Russian-Chinese alliance an alliance of uneasy allies. I think that Xi Jinping and the Chinese want stability to bring China back into prosperity. They don't want adventures, and I don't think they were very happy about this war at all. On the other hand, the Chinese leadership which has been attacked by the Americans recently in all kinds of little provocative ways, you know, with TikTok and Huawei and other things, and the new policy that the U.S. has developed over Taiwan, is upset very much with the United States and sees Russia's standing up to the United States in a positive way. But here's what's really important about the Chinese connection to Russia. The only power in the world, I think, that can convince Putin to stop the war, to make significant concessions, to try to withdraw, is China. Whether they'll do it or not, whether they have that kind of clout, I don't know. But no one else is out there. No one else really can act as a mediator. Not Turkey, which has tried. Not NATO powers like Macron or Schultz or whomever. Others can't do it. Xi Jinping really holds a card. So let's see what happens this winter as the ground begins to freeze in Ukraine and as one side or the other thinks it might gain some ground and gain a potential partial victory in some kind of offensive. Let's see if that turns the table and if in fact China will act in some constructive way to bring this thing to an end.
Let's certainly hope that it does. And, well, Professor, in what way has this war over the past 10 months really taken you by surprise or not surprised you over the past year?
A big surprise, a very big surprise. Actually, I'll tell you a story. On the very eve of the invasion, I had written an article which was about to come out the next day. That is the morning of February 24th. And that night, I got a call from the editor. And the editor said, they've started the invasion. We have to pull the article. I was saying that Putin did not need to invade, that he had made his point, and that it would be foolish. It would be a terrible geopolitical blunder to try to invade, conquer, and occupy Ukraine. Well, Putin didn't read that article because it wasn't published at the time. He has to wait. I doubt he reads those articles anyway. And in fact, he committed the blunder. And now he's knee-deep in the mud of Ukraine with no way to get out. So I had calculated that Putin was realistic, pragmatic, sensible. Occasionally he would take risks, like the seizure of Crimea in 2014. But in general, he was much more cautious. But I was wrong. In fact, he launched this terrible gamble. And now not only Ukraine, which is paying the heaviest price, but Russia itself is paying its price. And its government has become more unstable, more fragile than I've ever seen in the last 20 years.
So while he was not as clever as you thought he may have been, unfortunately, and well, do you still think there is a diplomatic or political solution to this war? And if so, what would such a scenario look like?
I've been trying to think about that a lot. I've made suggestions. I've even gone on the radio here in the United States and written pieces saying what we need first is a ceasefire in place, and then everyone come to the table and talk together and see how we can stop the killing, first of all, and maybe then work out some kind of arrangement. There were times when we were close to that, in March, let's say, but neither side seems now interested or willing to compromise. They both are going to make, I think, some kind of last-ditch offensive, and we'll see how that ends up. But solutions are possible. First of all, Ukraine can become a neutral state, as some arrangement can be made on a federal basis that would maybe even bring the Donbass back into Ukraine. Things like that may be possible, but now they're long shots. I become more and more pessimistic as the days go by. But spring is around the corner. Days have started to get longer, one by one, and maybe there's some hope, say in February of next year or March or April.
Well, we continue to hold on to that hope and really hope that these political leaders heed your advice, Professor. Well, that was Professor Ronald Suny, Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. Thank you again so much for your time, and have a happy new year.
감사합니다. You have it too.
감사합니다, Professor. Thank you so much. Also, a big thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Global Insight will be back tomorrow at the same time here on Arirang TV, so do tune in then. Have a great day wherever you are. Goodbye.